All right, folks. I hope you're doing great. I believe I am live. Real quick question. On a scale of 1 to 10, where is your energy level right now? 10, the most energetic you ever been. 1, you're ready to go back to sleep. Where are you? I know people are going to be all over the place. I usually tell people in classes over 5 will be all right. Under 5 might be a little struggle getting going here. But either way, we'll get through this together. Welcome um, to my class on adapting and thriving, how to navigate the recent changes in real estate laws and our industry. Amina Badros, and I'm going to take you through some things today that's, I think, going to clear up some things for you regarding buyer agency compensation and pretty much kind of what's going on. But I want to start out with this. Um, Early on in my corporate days, there was a senior vice president I worked under. She was a very powerful woman in her character and how she conducted business, but also very compassionate and personable. And she would say this: take news as is, neither bad nor good, just is, and see how to move forward. Right? Um, she was a highly awarded leader in our business company industry, and I think this quote, it stuck to me for long after, and I think it's very applicable to what's going on right now. When the news hit of the NAR settlement, a lot of people were fearful, a lot of people were scared, some people were optimistic. The reality is, whatever happened, happened, right? The news are is what it is, and we need to see how to move forward. So good leaders, even if you're just leading yourself and your own business, good leaders know how to stay even keel, not get too up or too down, but take the news as it is, as it comes, and see how to move forward. So take the news as is, neither bad nor good, just is, and see how to move forward. I think that will help you navigate this buyer agency compensation changes that we're going through. Really quick, a little bit about me, and I'll be very brief. I started real estate as an investor, then I got my real estate agent license, then I got my real estate broker's license. I'm really passionate about training and development and really teaching people and giving people valuable information that will help them in their business and in their life. I've been teaching and training for about half of my life, way before I got into real estate in the corporate world, in the education world, and in the nonprofit sector. Um, so when I got into real estate and after getting some experience as an agent, I began teaching. I got contracted by a company that a lot of you are familiar with, Bright MLS, which I believe is probably the second biggest MLS in the country. And I got to travel and train folks on Bright, do real estate business clinics with realtors and brokers across different states. And what was pretty interesting about that is I got to see how people are doing business differently, and I'll come back to that. And for the last several years, I've been a licensed instructor. I teach a lot, and some of the designations that I teach often, and I've been teaching for years, are the ABR, the Accredited Buyers Representative, the SRS, the Seller Representative Specialist, and the RENE, the Real Estate Negotiation Expert. So I'm pulling for this class, I'm pulling in some information that I teach, obviously some information from my experience and whether I was doing or learning or teaching. I'm bringing some of the best stuff here for you, right? And later on at the end of this webinar, I'll show you how to get some of those courses and trainings even at no cost to you. I currently teach for a school, so people pay to get these courses. These are NAR approved courses, but I'll show you how to get some courses at no cost to you in the end. So that's a little bit about me and my experience. So let's dive into it. Last week, I did a live on pretty much the updates and what's going to change. I'm not going to go over all of that again, but I just want to recap a few points because this is really going to guide our conversation. And these are the big changes we have to brace ourselves for, right? And I highlighted them for you right there. So as of mid-July, there will be no offer of buyer broker compensation in the MLS. Okay, so what does this mean? This means that there will no longer be buyer agency compensation input in the MLS by listing brokers to offer to buyers agents. Okay, can sellers still pay a buyer agent? Yes, they can. It just cannot be on the MLS. Okay, and we'll dive into that later. But the big change come mid-July, there's not going to be an offer of compensation for buyer agents that's going to be listed in the MLS or any third-party sites. Okay. The second big thing, and if you look at the top right, is the buyer broker needs to negotiate their fee and services prior to a showing. So no longer can buyer agents get a call of someone who wants to buy a home, schedule a showing, and run out and show the property without first sitting and discussing the fees that the buyer brokerage is going to be expected to be paid, right? And if you see there in the bottom left, you may not offer your services as free. Okay. So two big things: no buyer agency compensation in MLS. And before you represent a buyer as an agent, you need to discuss the services you're providing and the fees that you're providing before even showing a property, right? I think it's actually going to be for the best. I think it's going to create more professionalism and really increase our professionalism on the buyer agency side. It's really important to know that not everything is final. As of this moment, it still needs to be approved by a judge. The settlement, most likely it will. But even post settlement, there will be changes, right? So PAR, for example, Pennsylvania Association of Realtors, they already announced that they're going to review and possibly update some of the PAR forms, okay? So there might be some updates to the forms from the state level or from state associations like PAR. There are also going to be updates to forms from brokerages. My brokerage, for example, released a rider, an additional form that goes along with the listing agreements. And I'm going to show you just a screenshot of that later on. Obviously, we're going to see some updates and changes to the MLS rules. Definitely come mid-July. You're not going to see buyer agency compensation on the MLS. And MLSs may, add additional policy or make other changes for all the pieces to kind of fit together. We might also see updates to policies and procedures at your company level, right? So every brokerage should have a policy and procedures manual. We're going to see some updates to that. Most brokerages will make some changes. We're also going to see some updates to other laws and programs that are impacted by this. For example, VA financing, right? So all the pieces of the puzzle kind of have to fit together. The settlement was the first announcement, and it outlined some changes, which I just went over on the last slide. But for everything to kind of be in line, some things will change. So look out for updates and changes to forms, right, to the MLS rules, to policies and procedures, and to other laws and programs. So those few slides were actually some of the things I went over last week. So let's dive into the buyer agency compensation conversation and what's false, right? First, I'm gonna start off with some of the myth out there. So don't fall for the misinformation. Don't fall for the false information that's out there. So here are a few things that are simply false. There's a statement about the settlement prohibits sellers from paying a commission to a buyer's agent. That is simply false. The commission or buyer agency compensation will no longer be allowed to be on the MLS, but sellers still have the choice, if they want to, pay a buyer agent. Okay. Commission is always negotiable, and you might hear me say this throughout. Commission has always been negotiable. Commission is negotiable, and I don't see that changing. Okay, list sellers did not have to pay a buyer agent commission. Some MLSs had a co-op requirement, and it could have been as low as $1, for example, right? But commission was always negotiable, and sellers have the choice. So sellers currently have the choice not to pay a buyer agent compensation, but they also have the choice to pay a buyer agent compensation if they choose to. Okay. Another myth is that the settlement relieves the sellers from the financial burden, meaning in simpler terms that the seller is going to have less cost when they close on a home. And that may be true, but not necessarily. Here's the reality. There will be many buyers who need assistance, right, in order to purchase that home, in order to complete the transaction. There are many buyers who do not have the sufficient funds to be able to pay for down payment, closing costs, inclusive of buyer agency commissions. So, some buyers, through their buyer's agents, will negotiate with the seller concessions, okay, that would cover some of the buyer's closing costs, inclusive of the commission. So, will we see more seller concessions? Will we see more negotiations from the buyer end or the buyer agent end? Possibly. So, will the sellers have less cost overall? Not necessarily. Again, even if they don't pay a commission, they might be paying concessions or seller's assist or seller credit, whatever you call it in your market. Again, commissions always negotiable. Another myth that I'll dispute, and then we'll go into how to have the conversations with your clients. Excuse me. Um, there's a myth that the settlement forces brokers to reduce their commission, and that is simply false, right? Commission has always been negotiable. There is no set or standard commission. And later on, I'm going to show you the agreements and the current agreements before any changes. And you'll see the actual text in there, right? So there is no set commission, there is no standard commission, and there is no limitations neither, right? It's whatever the broker and the client come to agreement on. So these things are simply not true. So don't fall for the things that are false. So agents, what do you do now? I'm going to break it down into working with buyers, then working with sellers, and then I'm going to share with you some resources. So as far as working with buyers, you need a buyer agency compensation, right? You need a buyer agency agreement in place to guarantee your compensation, okay? As it was said on a few slides ago, you cannot take out, someone to a showing without first explaining your services and the fees you charge for those services. So when a buyer calls you, or when a potential buyer calls you and they want to go house shopping, right? Before we schedule a showing and we go out there and show them homes, we need to sit with them and discuss the fees with them, and hopefully sign a buyer agency agreement. Okay. So a few bullet points here, right? When it comes to buyer agency compensation, you should have an amount that your brokerage will charge for the services that you're providing for the buyer. Okay. You should clearly state the circumstances under which the buyer will owe you or your brokerage compensation. So how much you're expected to get paid, in what scenarios would that buyer pay you that fee, right? And most agreements out there state that the buyer will owe compensation only if compensation is not collected from the seller or listing broker. I'll show you an example of that in a few slides, and I'm going to break down to you on the contract itself, okay? So as a buyer agent, you need to sit down with your buyers. You need to explain the fees that you are charging and the services that you are providing, right? And when would the buyer pay for those fees? If you go through the buyer agency agreement, I'll show you, it actually breaks all of that down, and I'll share the Pennsylvania example. Here's a few things from the Code of Ethics, and none of this stuff is new. It's always been there. It just now people have a heightened awareness of it because of the recent news and changes. So before you enter into a buyer agreement, it says realtors must advise the buyer, okay, of the following. One, the realtor's policy regarding cooperation, basically how you cooperate with other brokers. Two, the amount of compensation to be paid by the client, right? And three, the potential for additional or offsetting compensation from other brokers, sellers, and other parties, right? When I show you the agreement, it's going to be more simple and going to make more sense, all right? And then lastly, any potential for the buyer's agent to act as a dual agent. So if anytime you would act as a dual agent, all right? Cool. So why should you get a buyer agency agreement? In most states currently, and that might change, currently a buyer agency agreement is not legally required, okay? So you can take a buyer, you can do the entire transaction without ever having a buyer agency agreement, you can close and nothing would stop you, right? Unless your policy, broker's company policy has that in place and they require it. But legally, a buyer agency agreement is not required. However, moving forward, as we said, that one of the changes coming is that the buyer broker needs to negotiate the fee and services prior to showing a property. So having a buyer agency agreement in place spells all that out, right? Reduces your risk and doesn't leave anything unclear. A big purpose for the buyer agency agreement, especially moving forward, is that it establishes your compensation at the time of the agreement. So as a buyer's agent between you and your buyer, you establish what you agree on in regarding to compensation. That's a conversation and an agreement between the agent and the buyer. Obviously, the agent has to do what they're allowed to by their brokerage, right? And within the parameters their brokerage allows. But this is a conversation and agreement between the agent and the buyer. It is not with the seller or the listing agent. And I'll say this again, I've said it before, compensation is negotiable. So let's look at the buyer agency contract. This is from PAR, Pennsylvania Association of Realtors, and I'll break down some of the contract language in the buyer agency agreement. Under 2A, so 2 is about the broker's fee. So when we talk about the broker's fee, it's the entire fee, right? No association of realtors has set or recommended a broker's fee. Broker and buyer have negotiated the fee broker will receive for exercising professional knowledge and skills in locating and assisting buyer in the acquisition of real property, which is available and suitable for buyer. So here it says there is no set fee, that the broker and the buyer have negotiated the fee. Okay, so commission is negotiable and there is no set commission. 2B, the broker's fee paid by buyer to broker is as follows. A, with the seller represented by a real estate broker, the fee is whatever percent or a certain dollar amount and anything additional. Okay, so under A here, it spells out where the listing is represented by a real estate broker. How about if the listing is not represented by the real estate broker and you represent a buyer? Well, this could be a different commission. Under B, it said with a seller who is not represented by a real estate broker, the fee is whatever percent or whatever dollar amount, okay, and anything additional, okay? So you have two scenarios here. You represent a buyer and you're going after a home that's represented by a listing agent, or you're going after a home that's not represented by a listing agent. Under that, it talks about lease transactions. We won't dive too much into that, right? Number 3 is where we talk about the fact that we're going to get, compensation from the listing agent, or that's our policy, right? So it says it is the broker's policy to accept compensation offered by the listing broker, all right, if the amount received from the listing broker is less than the amount essentially negotiated between the buyer and the broker, okay, the buyer will pay the broker the difference unless the seller agrees to pay the difference as a term in the agreement of sale. So it's saying to the buyer, here's what we charge, right? And here's what we negotiated when we handled services for you as a buyer, okay? And then at number 3, it says that it's our policy to try to get that compensation from the listing broker. Now, if the listing broker is offering less than what the agent and the buyer negotiated, then the buyer would be asked to pay the difference unless the seller is paying that difference through the agreement of sale, so through concessions and through negotiating, okay? Number 4 here, it says a dollar amount of broker's fee is earned and due non-refundable at signing of this buyer agency contract. So out of this fee that we agreed to between the agent and the buyer, the brokerage can collect a certain amount upfront at the signing of this buyer agency contract. And that amount can be non-refundable. Okay? So the agent and the buyer, they agree to a fee, right? The buyer agent is saying, we're going to try to get this from the listing broker. However, if there is a deficit, if there's a difference there, the buyer, we're going to ask you to pay for it unless we can get it from the seller, right? Through negotiating or through concessions. There is a fee that the brokerage can collect upfront, which becomes a part of the total fee. And then the balance, right? It says the balance of the broker's fee is earned if buyer enters into agreement of sale during the terms of this contract. Okay. So you can collect a portion of the fee upfront at the signing of the representation agreement, and then the remaining of it really when they go under contract, or most do it at closing, right? So again, that's the breakdown of how the current language reads, and we might see some changes. It already outlines what is being negotiated between the agent and the buyer through different scenarios. It already mentions the fact that we're going to try to get this from the listing broker, and it mentions that the buyer may be responsible for the difference. It also mentions the fact that we can collect a fee upfront, right? And then the balance would be if the buyer goes under agreement during the time of this buyer agency contract, right? Cool. So now we're going to move to the sellers really quick, and conversations with the sellers about buyer agency agreement. So if you represent the seller, and as we talked about the myths earlier, but sellers are not required to pay buyer agents. However, sellers still have the choice to pay buyer agents if they want to. So a conversation may go like this: when you're at the listing appointment, or when you're doing your seller consultation, whatever you want to call it, you're going to discuss the services that you're providing as a listing brokerage. Okay, so you're going to discuss the listing services that you're providing, and you're going to discuss the fees for those services. Okay, then you're going to talk with the seller about buyer agency compensation, about what their options are, about what are the pros and cons for offering or not offering buyer agency compensation, about the economics of home buying, about how most buyers will likely need, right, some sort of assistance, about the offer terms that could change. So if you don't offer compensation, might be some buyers may ask for concessions or assistance, right, so that they can cover some of their closing costs. And also sellers should know their net sheet, right? What is their estimated closing costs going to be? What are they going to net from the sale? So you should, as a listing agent, talk with the seller about the services you're providing on the listing side and the fees you're collecting for that, right? Obviously, that's negotiable. Then you want to talk with the seller about any amount that they want to pay to a buyer agent, right? And talk through that. What are their options? What are the pros and cons? How would it play out, right? What are they going to net? And then obviously the seller has to decide. It is the seller's decision, and they have to authorize that. All right, cool. So a few things that you need to discuss with the seller before entering into a listing agreement. Very similar. You need to advise the seller of your company policy regarding cooperation, how you're going to cooperate with other brokerages, and any compensation that you will offer to sub-agents, buyer agents, or other brokers, right? So you can still offer compensation. You just can't provide it on the MLS, right? It can be on a private broker website. It cannot be on third-party sites or the MLS. As I mentioned, you're going to see some changes in forms, some additions. Here's an example of a company rider, essentially an additional form to the listing agreement. This is for my company, and they're already releasing buyer toolkits and additional forms for listings. I just want to point out the sections for you. So this breaks down to a seller what is the fee for listing, right? The listing professional service fee. And it says client will pay brokerage a real estate commission in the amount that's equal to certain percentage of purchase price or a certain dollar amount, right? And they're calling this the listing professional service fee, essentially the fee for the listing side of things, okay? And then under B, it says buyer broker service fee. And it gives check boxes, options for the client, the seller, to select. client chooses to compensate, or they can check client chooses not to compensate the real estate brokerage company that finds the buyer, right? So why did my company do this, and why will maybe other companies do the same? This really puts it in clear that here is our listing services, and here's what we're charging for our listing services side of things. Now, seller, do you want to compensate a buyer, agent, broker, or do you not? Right? So I think this spells it out very clear. And this would be in addition to the listing agreement we use at the state level. And there's additional terms in it, right? But this is just an example of brokers creating forms, really breaking down what is the listing fee if sellers want to compensate a buyer broker, and what are those fees looking like, right? Just another way for us to be compliant and make sure that we are clear in what we are communicating with our clients. Okay, so that was my company's additional rider. Excuse me. Here is actually the PAR, Pennsylvania Association of Realtors listing agreement, which is the exclusive right to sell real estate. Okay, it says that no association of realtors has set or recommended the fee, that the broker and the seller have negotiated this fee that the seller will pay. All right. So again, there is no set or standard fees, that the seller and the broker have negotiated this fee. And then it says the broker's fee is whatever percent of sale price or whatever dollar amount, whichever is greater, and blank amount of money paid to the broker by the seller as follows, right? Number one, certain dollar amount of broker's fee is earned and due non-refundable at signing of this listing contract. So in the buyer situation and in the seller situation currently, right now, before even any form changes, brokers have the right and can put in there an amount that they will collect at the signing of that representation agreement, right? This is much longer than the buyer side, so I put on another screenshot. Section 2 here outlines the conditions, or when will a seller owe commission to their listing broker. For example, when the property sell, if they procure a ready, willing, and able buyer, if it goes under contract and then the seller decides not to sell, right? There's a few different scenarios here where essentially the seller will still owe the listing brokerage some type of fee, okay? And then C here says if the sale occurs, balance of broker's fee will be paid upon delivery of the deed. So again, if you're collecting a portion up front, when is the remaining going to be paid? It says here at the transfer of the deed, or essentially usually paid at closing. Okay. 6, if an agreement of sale is signed and settlement does not occur and deposit money is released to the seller. So if you're a listing agent, you take a contract, you go under contract, and then the buyer ends up backing out for maybe no justified reason, and the seller keeps the deposit. It says here that the seller will pay broker X amount from the deposit money. Again, if you're a listing broker or listing agent, you take a listing, and then you go under contract, and the buyer decides to cancel for no reason justified in the contract, and the seller is keeping the deposit, the listing broker has the right, obviously, if negotiated in this agreement, to keep a portion of that deposit as written here, right? And then number 7 goes into the cooperating broker's fees. Now, some of this language might change because it mentions MLS, so I do anticipate some changes here, but it essentially breaks down what you are going to pay out of your total broker's fee to a sub-agent, to a buyer's agent, or to a transactional licensee, right? So I just wanted to break that down for you on contract language. There's a funny thing I heard when I first started training is that RDR, realtors don't read, right? So I'm sure you've signed these contracts or sent these contracts plenty of times to be signed, whether or not you actually read every word or realtors read every word of the contract. I'm not sure, so I put it there for you, right? So one of the things that was really intriguing when I was traveling and doing some contract work for Bright, as I mentioned, was really getting to see how people did business differently in different areas. And not just in different states, but even if you drive like an hour away, under the same state guidelines, under the same code of ethics, people just had different business practices, right? So there are different types of compensation. The most type of compensation we use, or how realtors often get paid, is a percent of sale price, right? We get a commission that's usually a percentage of the sale price of that home or that property. However, it's not the only way to get paid. Okay. You can get paid via flat fee. You can get paid via retainer. You can get paid via an hourly rate, right? Or it could be a combination of any of all of these things, as we kind of seen in the contract, right? The contract had a percentage. It also had an amount. If you wanted to do a flat fee, it had a non-refundable amount that some people might kind of use as a retainer. Okay, whatever is really negotiated between the seller or between the client and the broker, right? Whether it's a seller or a buyer. But brokers can charge their client, whether that's a buyer or a seller, a percent of sale price, or a flat fee, or a retainer, right? Or an hourly rate, or a combination of any of all of this stuff. Now, a lot of times in real estate, you meet people that say, well, we don't do that. That's not how we do business in this market, right? We've never done it this way. Here, directly from the Code of Ethics, it says that this article in the Code of Ethics is not intended to prohibit aggressive or innovative business practices, which are otherwise ethical, and does not prohibit disagreements with other realtors involving commissions, fees, compensation, or any other forms of expenses. What does this mean? It means that essentially, as long as it's ethical, as long as it's legal, you can do it, right? Obviously, commission is negotiable. So whatever you, the agent or the broker, negotiate with your client and come to terms upon, come to agreement on, right? As long as it is legal, as long as it is ethical, as long as it's compliant with your company policy, then you can do it. And if other realtors or other brokers in the marketplace don't like what you're doing or disagree, that's okay, right? That's what business is about, right? We're going to see different models. We're going to see different practices. We're going to see people get creative and innovative, right? As long as it's within the confines of what is legal, what is ethical, and what is compliant with your company policy, you can do it, right? So don't be scared to be innovative, be creative, as long, again, it's ethical, legal, and compliant with your company policy, okay? Cool. A few things just to kind of leave you off with and show you some more resources. Very important, I think, as an agent, whether a listing agent or a buyer's agent, you're going to need to be able to articulate your value to the client, right? Why should you be paid for the services that you offer? What services are you even offering in the first place, right? And what value are you providing for that client, okay? And then being able to negotiate those fees with your client and with the other party as well. So being able to articulate your value is very critical, right, as an agent and as a broker, and also being able to negotiate your fees with your own clients and with the other parties that are involved, right? Real quick thing on negotiating. This is a definition of negotiating, and I use this in the real estate negotiation expert class. I think it's a great and simple definition, right? And in a time where communication is not very high on a lot of people's list, what is negotiating? Negotiating is really back and forth communication. So it takes communication designed to reach a mutual agreement where the parties have some things in common and other items that might be opposite. So what is negotiating? Negotiating is about having a conversation, communicating back and forth. And the objective, the goal of the negotiation is to reach an agreement, is not to show who's right, who's wrong, who's stronger, who deserves this, who has the right for this. The goal of a negotiation is to reach an agreement. So as an effective negotiator, in your mind, you want to have as much conversation as possible. And your goal, your objective, your focus is getting to a mutual agreement with whoever you're negotiating with. And understand this third point, right? The people coming to a negotiation already have some things in common and maybe some things that are opposite. A buyer and a seller coming together to negotiate. A buyer wants to buy, the seller wants to sell, right? They agree on that, but they might not agree on maybe the terms of the offer. Okay, so the parties that are negotiating, there's already commonality in place. Find out what that is, use that to build on what's common, and then work out the things that are differences, right? Just wanted to kind of give you a little nudge of that on negotiating. A few resources here for you. I think it's very important that you become an expert advisor, not just an agent, right? I think the public perception of a real estate agent is very low. We see it, in the news. We've seen it on these lawsuits. You need to become an expert advisor, and here's a few resources for you. I mentioned the ABR course, the Accredited Buyers Representative. Another thing on buyers, the CHBA, the Certified Home Buying Advisor. I can actually give both of those to you for free right now, or I should say at no cost to you. All you got to do is scan that QR code. It's going to take you to a link to book a call with me, and I can share with you how to get those. So right now, you can get the Certified Home Buying Advisor course and training along with the Accredited Buyers Representative course. Both of those for free to you. Just scan the QR code, schedule a call with me, and I'll share with you how to do that. I'm not selling them or selling you anything at all, right? On the listing side, there's also the CHSA, the Certified Home Selling Advisor. I can probably get that for you as well. And then the SRS, the Seller Representative Specialist. Unfortunately, I can't get that free for you. I teach SRS and ABR for schools, so they get paid for them, and then they pay me to teach it. But I do have access to get you the ABR for free, as well as the CHBA, the Certified Home Buying Advisor, and the CHSA, the Certified Home Selling Advisor. These courses, along with the Real Estate Negotiation Expert I mentioned, they have a ton of valuable information, right? And I think now more than ever, you need to become an expert advisor. You need to really understand how to best work with sellers. You need to really understand how to best work with buyers. You need to really understand how to negotiate, how to break down these contracts, right? The conversations about compensation, all the different options, and really negotiate, break that down, communicate that, and negotiate that with your clients and with the other parties. So hopefully you guys found this valuable. I see that pretty much the majority of you stayed on the entire time, so that's always a good sign, right? So definitely take advantage of these courses. I just want to provide resources to you, not selling anything. Scan the QR code, book a call with me. I'm more than happy to share these resources with you and share with you anything that could be helpful to you as you navigate this. As I mentioned early on, I'm really passionate about teaching and more so giving people valuable information to help them in this business and life. And right now, I think is a critical time, and a lot of people need help. And I'm here to provide as much help as I can. So scan the QR code, book a call with me. I'll get you those resources, and whatever else I can do for you, I am happy to help. Take care.